I stood there, barefoot in the freezing sand, watching two guys in neon vests drill a new deadbolt into my front door, my own front door. 20 yards away, the Atlantic was churning, and a real estate sign was swinging in the salt wind like a middle finger. On the deck, Elaine Harper, the HOA president, stood there with a clipboard tucked against her hip like she just personally conquered the ocean. She was actually smiling until she saw me. "You should have responded to the notices, Daniel," she called out, her voice as flat as the horizon. 6 months of abandonment. The board followed procedure. This property has been seized and sold. I just looked at her, then back at the sold sign. She'd done it. She hadn't foreclosed. She'd just taken it. What she didn't know, what none of those self-important board members knew, was that the dock permit hanging in my hallway wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a federal shoreline easement tied to my family name since 1968. And by selling my house to a couple of unsuspecting retirees, Elaine hadn't just overstepped a bylaw. She just triggered a legal landslide that was about to swallow her entire association whole. If you've ever dealt with an HOA that thought it could bully the wrong person, stick around, because what happened next cost them every penny they ever had. My name is Daniel Mercer. For 22 years, my job was making sure people didn't build the wrong thing in the wrong place along the American coastline. I spent most of that time as an infrastructure engineer for the Coast Guard before moving into private maritime surveying. My world revolves around one cold, hard truth. Shorelines are fragile, and the laws protecting them are complicated enough to ruin anyone who ignores them. The ocean doesn't forgive mistakes, and neither do the federal regulations written to protect it. That beach house, it wasn't just some vacation trophy. My grandfather built it in the late 60s, back when this stretch of the island was nothing but fishermen, rusted trucks, and weather docks. Even now, the place smells like salt-soaked cedar the second you crack the door. The siding is bleached bone white by the sun, and the dock out back still creaks the exact same way it did when I was 10 years old, dropping crab traps within the sunrise. It's where my family learned how to listen to water. The neighborhood eventually built up around it. An HOA formed, and I played nice. I paid the dues, kept the grass trimmed, and ignored the noise. But work had kept me traveling between ports for the last 5 months, and that's when Elaine saw her open. When I finally pulled my truck into the driveway that morning, something felt off. The dune grass had been trimmed with aggressive, surgical precision. There were bright orange landscaping flags in the yard that I didn't plant. And then there was the SUV. The shiny, silver thing parked like it belonged there. I stepped out, my boots crunching over loose shells, and my stomach just dropped. "That sold" sign was staring back at me. Red letters, bold as a heart attack. "What's going on?" I asked the contractors. The guy with the drill didn't even look up. "New owners moving in next week. HOA handled the transaction. We're just changing the locks, man." I looked up at the deck. Elaine was there, her perfect white hair not moving an inch in the breeze, flanked by 2 other board members like she was the queen of the dunes. She'd been the president for 6 years, and she lived for community standards. She hated part-time residents, called us absentee owners who dragged down property values. "What notices, Elaine?" I asked, my voice shaking with a mix of shock and pure, white-hot adrenaline. "The compliance violations, the delinquent assessments," she said, flipping a page on her clipboard. "You ignored multiple letters. Under our governing documents, the board voted to seize the property to recover losses. We auctioned it last week. Auctioned it like it was a storage unit full of old gym equipment." I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I've learned in my line of work that when someone is being this confidently stupid, you just let them keep talking until they've dug the hole deep enough. I got back in my truck and drove straight to my storage unit 2 towns over, where I had my mail forwarded. I cut open the bin and dumped it out. Dozens of envelopes. Final notice. Delinquent status. I checked the addresses. Every single one of them had been sent to an apartment in Wilmington I hadn't lived in for 3 years. An address I had legally updated with the HOA and the county tax office. I even had the confirmation email saved on my phone. This wasn't a clerical error. It was a setup. They'd intentionally sent the notices to a dead address so they could declare the property abandoned and flip it. The next morning, I was back at the house before the sun was even up. I found the buyers standing in my driveway, a couple in their late 30s, looking nervous. They were holding a folder and measuring the porch. "Morning," I said. They jumped about a foot. "Looking at the house you bought?" "Yes," the man said, looking confused. "We close next week." Ms. Harper said the association owned it due to abandonment. "I hate to be the bearer of bad news," I said, leaning against my truck, "but this property isn't for sale. It never was. And Elaine Harper doesn't have the title." The woman went pale. "What?" "We've already put down a massive deposit. They told us the title was clear." Right on cue, Elaine's SUV pulled up. She marched up the drive, her authority clipboard out like a shield. "Mr. Mercer, you're not authorized to be on this property. I've already told you. The parcel was lawfully transferred. I own this house, Elaine," I said, holding up my latest property tax receipts. "Deeds in my name. No foreclosure judgment. No court order. No transfer of title. You can't just seize a deeded property because you don't like how long the grass is. We followed the bylaws," she snapped. She actually called her private security, some guys in a white SUV with Coastal Patrol on the side. When they arrived, she pointed at me like I was a common thief. "He's trespassing. Remove him." The security guard looked at my ID, then at my tax receipts, then at Elaine. "Ma'am," he said, sounding like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Unless you have a court-ordered transfer of ownership filed with the county, I can't touch him. This is a civil dispute." The look on Elaine's face was worth more than the house itself. It was the first time I saw the mask slip. She wasn't just power-tripping anymore. She was realizing she'd sold a house she didn't own to people who were now staring at her like she'd just robbed them. That night, I sat in my kitchen, the house dark, listening to the tide. I called my attorney, Mark. He specializes in maritime law and property disputes. When I told him the HOA's redevelopment plan, which I'd heard about from a guilty board member at the marina, he actually laughed. "They want to turn your lot into a luxury rental." Mark asked, "Daniel, tell me you still have a 1968 easement." "Right here in my hand," I said. "Perfect," he whispered. "Because that easement means your property is designated as a federally monitored coastal zone. Any unauthorized transfer or interference with those rights doesn't just break the neighborhood. It triggers a federal regulatory review." Elaine didn't just steal a house. She just walked into a buzzsaw. I spent the next week gathering my ammunition. I found my grandfather's original manila envelope. The paper was yellowed, but the county seal was as clear as day. Permanent shoreline easement. It granted the owner the right to maintain the dock in a natural buffer that no private entity, not even a God Complex HOA, could touch without federal approval. We filed for an emergency injunction. When we walked into that courtroom, Elaine was there with her association lawyer, looking smug, probably thinking she could just cite some obscure bylaw about community aesthetics and call it a day. My lawyer didn't even talk about the grass. He just handed the judge the 1968 deed and the federal coastal designation. "Your Honor," Mark said, "the HOA didn't just fail to provide notice. They attempted to sell land that is under federal shoreline protection, effectively trying to bypass the National Coastal Management Act. They've essentially engaged in a fraudulent sale of protected land." The judge looked at the papers, then at Elaine, then at the HOA lawyer. The silence in that room was heavy enough to drown it. The fallout was beautiful. The sale was immediately voided. The buyers, rightfully furious, sued the HOA for fraud and emotional distress. The county opened an investigation into the board's redevelopment scheme, which turned out to be a kickback ring involving a local developer. But the best part? The legal fees alone bankrupt the HOA's insurance policy. They had to levy a special assessment on every single homeowner in the neighborhood just to pay the settlements. The last time I saw Elaine, she was packing a U-Haul. She'd been forced to resign. Her reputation was in the dirt, and the neighbors she'd tried to protect with her standards were now glaring at her because their monthly dues had tripled to cover her legal mess. I stood on my deck, leaning against the weathered cedar railing my grandfather put there 60 years ago. The real estate sign was gone. The new locks were gone. The only thing left was the sound of the tide bells ringing under the pilings. It's funny how people think a clipboard and a title like president gives them the right to rewrite the law. They see a quiet house and assume nobody's home. They see an old dock and think it's just wooden nails, not realizing it's anchored by 50 years of legal precedent and family history. The HOA thought they could flip my life for a profit. Instead, they learned that some things, like a man's home and the shoreline he protects, aren't for sale. But it makes me wonder, how many other people have lost their homes because they didn't have a yellowed envelope in a fireproof box? Is an HOA really a community, or just a corporation with a leash? What do you think? Is there ever a scenario where an HOA should have the power to seize a home, or is the whole system just a trap for the unwary? Let me know in the comments. I've got a feeling I'm not the only one who's had a fight for their own front door. If this story reminded you why you should always read your property deed, hit that like button and share this with anyone living under an HOA. Don't let them bully you into silence. See you in the next one.